People say, what do you do? And at heart, what I do is I'm a storyteller. Now, hopefully that doesn't mean that what the stories I tell are inaccurate, but there are so many stories. As I look at some of our young people here today, and I've learned in my older years that you really have to dig to find the truth in this society most of the time. So I'm all about not just telling stories, but finding the hidden gold. And when I watch that little piece on the war between the states, it just, my heart is full when I realize how many stories, how many truths of that age, of that conflict have been not only lost to history, but expunged and required to no longer be discussed or considered as respectable, legitimate, credible opinions or viewpoints on history. As a Christian thinker, my view is, and I've told my students this for many years, the Christian should pursue the truth wherever it leads and let the chips fall where they might, not to be afraid of it. That's why at my rather old age now, I have lots of opinions that I've held for a long time, but I've got quite a few that have evolved to some degree over the years, because I always want to be looking and searching for the truth, that I might be as much as possible in line with the Lord, having my mind renewed by Him and being conformed to His image. And sometimes finding the truth can be bracing. It can be, I know for me, painful at times, but I want to know what that is. Well, today we talk about a man who I just honestly don't remember learning about when I grew up and had Oklahoma history as a student in Duncan, Oklahoma. Maybe it was just because Steve Bias was, being the class clown and was kind of getting all of our attention. I couldn't pay attention, I don't know, but I was well into adulthood before I even knew that there was a Stan Weighty, as the title indicates, Cherokee Chief and Confederate General. And you saw the trailer on the war between the states. We've got that book back there. And by the way, Steve Bias, any copies of the war between the states and the Oklahomans we sell during this conference, we're going to make a donation of $5 per copy to Randall University. So any of y'all that get that, just know that it's not just going to the Dwyer Family Fund, it's going to Randall. Some of y'all have read Stonewall. It was my first book, a historical novel on the life of Old Jack. And the sequel picks up right where Stonewall leaves off, right before Gettysburg, Robert E. Lee. And then the Oklahomans, we have a 31-page chapter called Uncivil War that's just on the war between the states and Oklahoma and all the battles, some of which we'll talk about today. So Stan Weighty, Cherokee. We start out here with, this was kind of the ancient homeland, and I'm going to be looking up here a little bit when the print is small and I can't see it back there. The bulk of the Cherokees back in the 1700s, early 1800s lived in this area in the southeast United States, in particular the area encircled by red. Most of that northern Georgia, some western North Carolina, and southeast Tennessee. I've got a student at my current Southern Nazarene Oklahoma history class that is a descendant of Cherokees from North Carolina, which is kind of cool. Those were the ones that the feds could never get them to come down on the mountains, and they didn't come out here to Indian Territory. Dagadoga, that was the birth name of Stan Weighty, meaning in Cherokee, he that stands on 2 feet. Little do they know how appropriate that moniker, that sobriquet would be for him. He was born near modern-day Rome, Georgia. That's a picture of Rome, Georgia, in 1806. And he had a most distinguished, and I would consider one of the great heroes himself of Oklahoma history, older brother known as Buck Weighty. And Buck was such a sharp individual, 3/4 Cherokee, like his brother Stan Weighty. He was heard about, recommended for, and matriculated to the Cornwall Foreign Mission School in Connecticut, where he got a great education, not least of which because a gentleman named Elias Boudinot, or Elias Boudinot of New Jersey, recognized in young Buck Weighty a young man of surpassing stature, talent, and integrity, and became a mentor to him, became his financial sponsor the rest of the time that he was both at Cornwall and then went to Andover School for some theological training at the school that unfortunately later became Yale. So who was Elias Boudinot? Only for half a century a trustee at Princeton University, a strong advocate, even in that day and time over 200 years ago, of rights for blacks and Indians, a member of the American Revolutionary War Continental Congress, a colonel in the Continental Army, commissary of prisoners during the war appointed directly by his good friend George Washington, president of the Congress, which was de facto president of the United States at that point in 1782 and 83, including when the treaty was signed with Britain, Treaty of Paris, for American independence. He was also appointed by George Washington as director of the United States Mint, and he was the first president of the American Bible Society. So that was the formidable man that Buck Weighty was mentored by and esteemed highly enough that he took his own name. That's why when you navigate through Oklahoma history, be careful. There's not one, there's not just two, there are three Elias Boudinots. The first one was the great colonial American War of Independence hero. The second was Buck Weighty, and then the third was his son, Elias C. Boudinot, a famous Oklahoma boomer. Well, meanwhile, while Buck Weighty was accomplishing all of this and shining amidst the greatest minds and intellects of Puritan New England, his quiet younger brother, Stan Weighty, was back in Tennessee attending the mission schools of the Moravian Church. By the time he was 21 years of age, he had already secured his law license, had learned the English language, was serving at age 21 as clerk of the Cherokee Nation's Supreme Court, and later was a leader in the Cherokee Golden Age that led up to the Civil War. And just a bit of background on Stan Weighty. This is the type of stuff that even those of us that are aficionados of Stan Weighty have not often heard. His younger years. This comes from Wilfred Knight's great book, Red Fox, which I have a copy of here. He describes Stan Weighty's younger years, quote, "The Moravian Mission School educational training during his formative period imbued him with strong spiritual qualities. His letters and correspondence were occasionally reflective of his biblical knowledge, and he joined the Moravian Church while still in school." Well, along about this time, the great George Guest, we know him as Sequoia, part Scott, part Cherokee, created his wondrous syllabary, or basically alphabet formed of syllable letters, if you will. You young people, one of the great challenges I see today for young people, for the millennial generation, is it's so difficult for them to stand against the tide, against the flow. If all the people around them are saying one thing, doing one thing, it's real hard for them to buck that and go the other way. Well, Sequoia is a great example. If you're following the Lord and you're doing His work, you keep going, because for 12 years he was marginalized. He was scoffed at. He was scorned by his fellow Cherokees. They thought he was crazy for this idea that he was putting together his syllabary, until he finally finished it in the early 1820s, and they saw what a remarkable feat he had accomplished with what they called the talking leaves. And that was one of the reasons why the Cherokees zoomed past so many other tribes in their ability to not just assimilate into American culture, but many times in the southeastern United States, and then once they got here to Oklahoma, into territory, to ascend to the leadership of the American culture around them. So this was a time of great learning and great accomplishment by the Cherokees. Within a few years, that syllabary had led to the establishment and publication of the first Aboriginal newspaper or publication of any sort in North America, the Cherokee Phoenix, which was co-edited by the aforementioned Buck Weighty, Elias Boudinot, and white Presbyterian missionary Samuel Worcester. And by the way, it started in 1828. If you haven't been to the History Center in Oklahoma City, or if you haven't been lately, I encourage you to go. But don't go on your lunch hour. Go on a Saturday or sometime when you can stay there all day if possible, because you can't get through the whole thing in a day. They have a massive treasure trove of documents that includes an original copy from the 1820s of the Cherokee Phoenix. How about that? Well, after a while, Elias Boudinot was so busy that Stan Watie, at, again, probably 22, 23, 24 years of age, began to serve as a de facto co-editor, because Elias Boudinot would be off doing work, mission work, teaching work, going to Washington, D.C. to petition on behalf of the Cherokees. And Stan Watie would be the editor when his older brother and Samuel Worcester were out of pocket. And by the way, what was beginning to happen now in the 1820s leading up to the period of the Trail of Tears was these pressures on many different fronts in many different ways on these five great, traditionally referred to as the five civilized tribes. I like to refer to them as the five Indian republics, because along with the Cherokees, they formed their own constitutions. They were business owners. They were, in so many ways, again, not just fitting into American society, but helping lead it. And yet there were great challenges. And one of the things that Elias Boudinot saw was that the white culture around them was having some deleterious, some awful effects on the Cherokee community. And this was one of the just many samples of the eloquent writing that Elias Boudinot had. As he looked around, he saw the social, while many people were saying, wow, look at the accomplishments we're having in our tribe, look at the advancements, Sequoia, the syllabary, the newspaper, the plantations, the schools, the churches. Elias Boudinot was saying, hey, let's not get so focused on those who are doing well on the haves that we forget that there is a vast sweep of our people here that are greatly suffering through moral conditions and reprobation. And here's what he said: intemperance, that is drinking to excess, is the curse of mankind. It spreads desolation in societies and families. It is the parent of strife, the cause of diseases, and almost every species of misery. It has been our shame, the Cherokees, in the eyes of other people, and has planted the common opinion that the love of whiskey is a necessary trait of the Indian's character. How long has that lasted? And by the way, I feel like I could speak to it, because with a great-grandfather named O'Dwyer, who came over in a boat from County Kildare himself, my family history is littered from one end to the other with alcoholism, with failed potential, with broken lives and families. And myself, I barely escaped it as a young man, was able by the grace of God to get past it. And I would agree with Robert E. Lee, who said late in his life, he'd observed enough to make him believe strongly that the only safety from alcoholic beverages was to just steer clear of them, because you never know if you're the one that is going to have a predisposed weakness for that. So young people, I would just say to you, stay away from it, no matter what your friends say. Boudinot continues about the drinking of alcoholic spirits. Among us, the Cherokees, it has been a wide spreading evil. It has cost us lives and a train of troubles. It has been an enemy to our national prosperity, industry, and intellectual improvement. We see this enemy of all good stalking forth in triumph, carrying desolation and misery into families and neighborhoods. The murders committed in this nation, the Cherokee Nation, with very few exceptions, are occasioned by intoxication. And what but whiskey produces all our accidents, all our strifes, fightings and stabbings? Well, this was one of the main reasons that over a period of time, Elias Boudinot and other mixed-blood Cherokee leaders began to think that whether we're forced or not, going west to a different domain, to a place where we can be free of these whiskey peddlers, gold seekers, and others that are just impairing our lives. This might be the best thing for us. It wasn't their first choice, but that's why you had this early intra-tribal civil strife, ultimately civil war, began within the Cherokees. The Cherokee tribe, and that's one thing my students, most of them are amazed to find out that the Native Americans were not just one monolithic group. There were many different tribes, there were many different personalities, histories, and heritages, and even within the individual tribes, such as the Cherokees, the Creeks, and others, there were often great differences of opinion. So Elias Boudinot and his younger brother Stan Weighty and others began to think that the government wanting to force us west to Indian Territory, they're going to pay us millions of dollars to do it. They're going to help us get out there. They're going to provide us free land and annuities. That's the best way to save our tribe. Well, unfortunately, the majority of the Cherokees, led by 7/8, that's right, 7/8 white man John Ross, who could not even speak Cherokee, had to have an interpreter, just stuck to their guns and said, we are going to stay here no matter what. The United States government offered millions of dollars, and there's a lot of opinion, especially among modern-day Cherokees. You know, are you pro-treaty party, which was the Stan Weighty and Elias Boudinot? Are you pro-Ross party? Those things, that's a very emotional argument. But for me, it's safe to say that Stan Weighty, Elias Boudinot had been great friends with John Ross. They came to be, though, very strong enemies, because this minority group of mixed-blood Cherokees signed the Treaty of New Echota in 1835, which defied Ross and the majority of the Cherokees. And it was a treaty with the U.S. government to move the whole tribe out here to Indian Territory, what we call Green Country, the northeastern part of Oklahoma around Tulsa and northeast. Its provisions included the move, paying the Cherokees millions of dollars, travel expenses, and temporary annuities. Well, what wound up happening was the government helped a couple of thousand of these Cherokees to get out here. That was not the Trail of Tears. It was an arduous journey, but it was not a back-breaking Trail of Tears, as happened with the majority of the tribe that continued to stay here until, as Elias Boudinot and Stan Weighty had warned them, the federal government will kill you if they have to if you don't move. And in fact, the federal government descended upon their dinner tables, their supper tables, men working in their shops, people working in the fields, and by the point of the bayonet, herded them into, in effect, they call them detention camps, similar to what we would call concentration camps, and then eventually unleashed them on the Trail of Tears, or the Trails of Tears, which was a mournful, under-provided for, poor medical care, exposure to the elements during the winter months. A significant percentage of the Cherokee and other Indian tribes died on that journey. Well, by the time they got out here, this had taken on a dispute of mortal proportions. And on a day in 1839, Elias Boudinot, his uncle, and his cousin, all three brilliant leaders of the Cherokees, were savagely killed by fellow Cherokees, who bitterly blamed them for the Trail of Tears. They said, if you hadn't sold us out, we wouldn't have had to come out here to the west. That's an actual picture that Steve Bias found for me through an old Chronicles of Oklahoma magazine of the knife that was stabbed in Elias Boudinot's back when he was not looking. I don't think there's an extant picture of the tomahawk that another man behind him, when he wasn't looking, used to basically crush his skull to jelly. So that began a period of intra-tribal civil war that went on a number of years. Stan Weighty and his followers went on a trail of vengeance. There's a famous episode where Stan Weighty had a face-to-face gunfight with a leader of the treaty party who was complicit in the murder of his brother, and Stan Weighty killed him. And this is where Stan Weighty's legend was beginning to be made. Will Rogers own grandfather. You go to his birthplace up on Oologah Lake in northeast Oklahoma, there's a plaque on there, James Rogers, killed by Ross Party members in 1842. Well, fortunately, Stan Weighty put the good of his family and his tribe and his community ahead of his own personal emotions, and reached out and came to a peaceful accord with John Ross in 1846. And that's what the period of the golden age of the Cherokee tribe came to be known as, from 1846 up until the war began, where they got along much better. But I mention all this because there were still those simmering embers that would blow up and explode into flames. Again, this tribal division, this bitterness that was just birthed and then flamed by the murder of people's loved ones and friends, and it would reappear again later in the war between the states. Well, as we talk about in our book, The War Between the States, America's Uncivil War, PBS and others, CNN and their little 30-second soundbite mentality won't tell you this, but a lot of different people went to war for a whole lot of different reasons. And by the way, you want to know why the Cherokees went to war and sided with the Confederacy? They weren't bashful about it all. They actually had a declaration of their own independence from the United States. So they wanted to make sure everybody knew why. And, back then the titles were as long as some of our books. Declaration by the people of the Cherokee Nation of the causes for which have impelled them to unite their fortunes with those of the Confederate States of America. Quote, Providence, that is the power of God, rules the destinies of nations and events by inexorable necessity, overrule human resolutions. In the states which still adhered to the Union or stayed in the Union, did not secede, a military despotism has displaced the civil power, and the laws became silent amid arms. Free speech and almost free thought became a crime. And they were specifically thinking of places like Missouri, cities like St. Louis, places like Maryland, cities like Baltimore, Kentucky, Delaware, what became West Virginia, where a lot of the people wanted to secede. They wanted to, in an orderly fashion, leave the Union for a lot of different reasons. And those movements were put down by force of arms bloodily. Legislators in some of the state houses of those states were hauled out of their beds with no word at night and thrown into prison, many of them for many years. And this was what the Cherokees were saying. We've been hosed down already in the past. We've already been moved out here we didn't want to be. And now this is happening. We're tired of this. We want to be with this other group. And by the way, the Confederate States came to them and treated them, the Cherokees believed, with much greater respect than the United States had. Unlike the USA, the Confederate States offered the Cherokees and the other Indian republics their own representation in the Confederate Congress in Richmond. They set up Confederate federal courts in Indian Territory, which the tribes have been begging for decades, so that they could have more law and order from the rampaging outlaws in old Indian Territory. The Confederates set one up in the Cherokee country and another farther south in the Choctaw country. Well, their declaration concludes, the mandate of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was set at naught by the military power. In other words, you've even defied your own Supreme Court, USA. And this outrage on common right, approved by a president, Abraham Lincoln, sworn to support the Constitution. So the Cherokees, the Choctaws, the Seminoles, the Creeks, they were out. And yes, Martha, there was a civil war that took place in Oklahoma. This is just a partial indication of some of the battles and skirmishes. Some of them, like Fort Cobb out west, are not on there, but there were a number of just really countless skirmishes and fights, mostly among the tribes that lived here and the federal government during those years. Well, it wasn't long after Fort Sumter where the Cherokee Indian Confederate troopers were in the middle of things. The Battle of Wilson's Creek, which if you head up northeast on I-44 out of Oklahoma, it's just a few miles into the Missouri side of the state line from Oklahoma, took place in 1861. Quite a few of Stan Weighty's eventual troopers were in this fight. He himself was not. But does this sound like something that Hollywood would make up? It wasn't, because all these people were actually in that battle. Frank James, brother of Jesse James, Wild Bill Hickok, Cole Younger of the Younger Brothers, William Quantrell, later the Quantrell Raiders, Ben McCullough, one of the most famous Texas Rangers ever to live. At this point, he was 50 years old, had white hair that came down over his shoulders and carried 2 6-guns. Bell Starr, known as Bell Shirley, became known later as the outlaw Bell Starr. And 30 Union soldiers who eventually became generals were all in that battle. Many of you all know, I know in this group, know that the Confederates won a resounding victory that day in the West, just as about the same time they did back east in Virginia at First Manassas or Bull Run. That was one of the things that reinforced for the tribes that, hey, these guys can actually win. We're geographically with them. We have a common adherence to the evangelical religious faith. We have the same markets as they do. Yeah, they were slaveholders also, but so were the Indians that went with the North from Indian Territory were slaveholders. They had so much in common, they said, let's go ahead and stick with these guys. They can actually win. It wasn't long, though, before Stan Weighty himself got into it. The great campaign of late 1861 where the Confederate Army chased the pro-federal Indians out of Indian Territory. Stan Weighty and his mounted troopers played a key role in the latter battles of that campaign. But where the Weighty legend was really crafted was a few months later, early 1862, in a battle that actually was a pivotal defeat for the Confederates. Like so many of these battles, the Union had one name, Fort Pea Ridge, the Confederates another, Elkhorn Tavern, so I have both names up there. This was a famous battle that took place in northeast Arkansas, but the key of that battle was, it was really a battle for who was going to have Missouri. Was Missouri going to be a Confederate state or a Union state? Because the state was split in half. Again, somebody forgot to teach me that in my American history classes. And by force of arms, mainly because the Confederates lost their main leadership, such as Ben McCullough, that Texas Ranger, James McIntosh, and others. The Union won that 2-day battle, and Missouri was lost to the Confederacy. But the reason I mention that here is that this was a resounding feat for Stan Weighty and his Cherokee mounted rifles, which they were beginning to be known as. This is how it was described in Wilfred Knight's book, Red Fox, that actual battle. I don't know, let's see here. Got ahead of myself, sorry. With Stan Weighty's troops dismounted and John Drew's, those were other Cherokees, men still in their saddles, the 2 Cherokee regiments swept forward along with part of the 9th Texas Cavalry. And the bearded, wild-eyed Texans matched strides through the brush with Weighty's warriors. This was a counterattack against the Union, brandishing shotguns, rifles, tomahawks, knives, and bows and arrows. Does the war in the West sound like it was a little bit different from the war in the East? Yes. Tomahawks, knives, bows, and arrows. The Indians charged with wild shrieks and war cries and hit Oosterhouse's Federal cavalry regulars even before he had a chance to pull his flying artillery back. They captured numerous cannon of the Union and turned it and used it on the retreating Federal soldiers themselves. And this was a place where Stan Weighty and his men were recognized as being, wow, they went against the best of the Federals head-to-head in a battle that the Confederates lost, but they won their part of the battle. And there's a famous Kurtz and Allison painting of that battle. And if you look on the most of the right hand, 1/3 of that painting are mounted Cherokees. riding into battle. Most of them are in the painting are wearing buckskins. I think they're probably wearing a lot of other things besides that, but at least they got it right for that time period. It was good. They recognized the Cherokees played a pivotal role in the portion of the battle where the Confederates were successful. And here's a famous quote some of y'all have heard. One of Stan Waitie's troopers told Mabel Anderson, who wrote a biography of Stan Watie years later, she asked him about that battle and how did you guys do so well in a battle that was so chaotic and confusing to the Confederates and ultimately unsuccessful. And this man said, I don't know how we did it, but Weighty gave the order, which he always led himself, and his men could follow him into the very jaws of death. The Indian rebel yell was given. Boy, would you hated to hear whatever that was. And we fought like tigers 3-1. It must have been that mysterious power of Stan Watie that led us on to make the capture of all those cannons against such odds. An eyewitness account. Another one of Waitie's troopers eventually became a judge in Pryor, Oklahoma, James M. Keyes. He wrote later, I regard General Stan Watie as one of the bravest and most capable men and the foremost soldier ever produced in by the North American Indians. He was wise in counsel and courageous in action. And one of the reasons he had such success was because he had people like this writing for him. Cavalry Scout Clem Rogers, father of Will Rogers. Well, it's exciting to hear about these exploits and these endeavors, but lest we forget the dirty, dark underbelly of war. Meanwhile, there were thousands of women, children, old folks that were refugeeing civilians. The federal civilians in Indian Territory mostly refugeed into Kansas. The Confederates, which there were tens of thousands of them, refugeed into North Texas, the Red River Valley country, Rusk County, and those areas down along where Bonham, Texas, Paris, Texas, Fannin, Texas are now. And they were out in the open for the most part, exposed in winter and summer. It was a cruel ordeal. In fact, it was cruel enough that many of them perished. Stan Watie and his wife, Sarah, who he always lovingly called Sally, had 5 children, 3 sons and 2 daughters. The first of these children to perish was Comiskey Watie, who died in the open. Stan Watie never got to see him again after the war began. Sarah Watie, his wife's own sister, Nancy, died in North Texas during this ordeal. So again, it's not hard to understand the deep feelings, the remorse, the bitterness, the hatred that was being kindled. We named our book The War Between the States, not the Civil War, because I don't believe that war was ultimately a civil war any more than, as the great economist, African-American economist Walter Williams would say, the American Revolution was a civil war, because the American colonists were not trying to take over the English government, right? They were trying to get away from it. The Confederate States of America were not trying to take over the government from Abraham Lincoln. They were trying to depart from it peacefully. And yet here in Indian Territory, it certainly was a civil war. It certainly was brother against brother. The line split down families. So you have Sarah Bell Watie, who must have been just a peerless woman, writing to her husband during the war. And she had heard that one of their other sons, the eldest, Saladin Watie, who was a decorated officer, served under his father, Stan Watie, that he and one of his best friends had supposedly murdered a Union prisoner. Well, sad to say, a lot of that went on both sides. Not because these people were, quote, bad people. It's because of the hatred. And, you kill my best friend, you kill my brother, you murder my daddy, and now you kill a buddy of mine and then you ran out of ammunition and tried to surrender? No, I don't think I'll let you surrender. That's the kind of thing that happened all the time. Well, this broke Sarah Watie's heart when she heard that one of her sons, Saladin, had been apparently involved in the murder of a Union prisoner. She wrote her husband, Stan Watie, "Tell my boys, my sons, to always show mercy as they expect to find God merciful to them. I do hate to hear such things. It almost runs me crazy to hear such things. I find myself almost dead sometimes thinking about it. Mothers, can you imagine finding out such a thing about your son, your beloved boy? If you should ever catch William Ross, who was an anti-treaty party, that was a follower of Ross, and the son-in-law of Cherokee Principal Chief John Ross, and he was a convert to the Federals along with John Ross and others during the war. Don't have him killed. I know how bad his mother would feel, but keep him till the war is over. I know they all deserve death, but I do feel for his old mother. And then I want them to know that you do not want to kill them just to get them out of your way. Isn't that remarkable? A wife writing her husband, who was leading the Confederate forces in Indian Territory, such a letter, taking it beyond the tactics and the strategies of battle campaigns. Well, Stan Weighty, can't say for sure if this was a response to that letter, but it was a letter he wrote to her. It's chronicled in Cherokee Cavaliers by Edward Everett Dale and Gaston Little. Some of y'all have read that book. This is a letter he wrote to his wife along about that time. It seems that is my doom. Let me act as I will. My conduct is always considered wrong. No, in other words, I'm always getting accused of atrocities. And my men, no charity was ever shown me, yet I've lived through it. And it would be supposed that I become hardened and would be reckless. But it still hurts my feelings. I am not a murderer. I call upon my God to judge me. He knows that I love my friends and above all my wife and children, the opinion of the world to contrary notwithstanding. Well, would you be surprised to know it wasn't that many months hence that, as I mentioned a moment ago, John Ross and a significant segment of the Cherokees had switched sides to the Federals when the Federals captured their capital. So they were now fighting against the Confederate Cherokees. See how this division and this blood vendetta, this Hatfields and McCoys type situation on a mass scale just got deeper and worse. And so it wasn't long after this that Stan Weighty and his Cherokee Mounted Rifles thundered into Tahlequah, the capital of the Cherokee Nation, and captured a bunch of people, including that same William Ross, that his wife had implored him, if you ever come across him, don't do him harm. And I'm very happy to say that same William Ross lived. In fact, he was released by Stan Weighty in a prisoner exchange. They did not harm him, and he ultimately became, after the war, principal chief, like our president, of the Cherokee tribe. Well, coming down to the final chapters of the war, 1864, as many of y'all know, Stan Weighty was appointed by the Confederate government as the only man of general rank from any Native American tribe on either side during the fighting of the war. He became a brigadier general. And then some of his greatest feats occurred. This painting, the original, is hanging on the wall outside of Dr. Bob Blackburn's office, head of the Oklahoma Historical Society in the History Center. It's also on the title page of our chapter, Uncivil War, about the war in Indian Territory in the book, The Oklahomans. This shows Stan Weighty and his mounted rifles capturing a Union riverboat called the J.R. Williams, painted by the noted Oklahoma artist Neil Taylor of Durant. Several $1 million worth of booty that they captured. And my friend back here, Dale Wade, raise your hand there, Dale. Afterwards, y'all, if you want to know more about that, keep your hand up for a minute, please, brother. If you want to know more about that event, he is doing a lot of original research himself. He's been out there in that area around on the Arkansas River near the towns of Vian and Tomahawk, and he's coming up with some good stuff that, as far as I know, hadn't been in any book before. Probably the greatest, most famous exploit of Stan Weighty and the Cherokee Mounted Rifles, which by now, of course, include not just Cherokees, but Choctaws, Chickasaws, Creeks, Seminoles, Caddos, and Osages, was the Second Battle of Cabin Creek. I don't know if any of y'all have been to, that's one of the reenactments. I went to a reenactment there some years ago. It was wondrous to see there were more people, more reenactors in that battle out near Veneta than there were in the original battle itself. And there were a few thousand in the battle itself, okay? Magnificent turnout. So I hope y'all will support such historic reenactments, Honey Springs and elsewhere. But in September of 1864, in the middle of the night, Stan Weighty and the Texas Cavalry unleashed one of the great ambushes in American military history on a massive Union wagon train that was coming down to Kansas to supply the entire Union forces in Indian Territory with everything from uniforms to food to weapons to ordnance. And this is a painting courtesy of Steve Warren, who's done some great work on this battle, historic work, the Second Battle of Cabin Creek. You can see there at night, accurately depicted there in the middle of the night, Stan Weighty was the mastermind of this incredible ambush, which netted for his beleaguered forces and starving refugees in North Texas tens of millions of dollars worth of supplies in 2018 value, clothed his entire army, fed every Confederate soldier and civilian for over a month, stopped the strategic Union advance, and his entire brigade re-enlisted, which at that point was very crucial late in the war. In fact, by the end of the war, Stan Weighty and the Confederate Cherokee Choctaw and all those other tribes that helped form his brigade had stolen so many Union horses from in and around Fort Gibson, where the Union headquarters was in Indian Territory, that Federal General James Blunt cavalry troopers were forced to become infantry. Well, that's one way to get people put afoot. But alas, it was not to be. Early 1865, the war came to a close. The Appomattox, General Robert E. Lee, with the greatest main portion of the Confederate Army, surrendered in early April in Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Again, maybe Steve Bias was acting up in class and distracted me. I didn't hear it, but I don't remember this from Oklahoma history, that the final Confederate general in the war to surrender was right here in modern-day Oklahoma, none other than Stan Weighty, pursued by federal armies all over the West, Oklahoma, Kansas, Missouri, Arkansas, Texas. They never caught him. He finally came out of the Kiamichi Mountains near Dokesville, which I don't know if it's still a town or not, in Indian Territory, in the old Choctaw country, because so many of those refugees and civilians he knew were suffering and starving. He said it's time to put this to an end, and that's a painting by Dennis Parker that hangs in the Oklahoma Capitol building. Well, just quickly, a couple of minutes here and I'll be done. After the war, Stan Weighty lived almost the exact amount of time that Robert E. Lee lived, 5.5 years as opposed to 5. But sadly, there was more hardship. Saladin Weighty, that brilliant oldest son who had been the Confederate Congress delegate to Richmond for the Cherokee tribe, died within a few hours contracting a strange disease in 1868. So he lost his second of 3 sons. Watie Weighty, who from my reading appears to me maybe of the sons at least, the most like Stan Weighty. It was a quiet, reserved, soft-spoken young boy, very thoughtful. And he wrote this poignant letter to his father after the war, because he knew that his father was basically almost living in a virtual shack because he was putting what little resources he had to educating his remaining children, including Watie Weighty. And he writes this letter. You can see I've left the grammar as it was. I feel proud to think that I have a papa that take the last dollars he has to send me chule. He wrote that letter to his father. And yet, sadly, within a few months of that letter being written, Watie Weighty died as well. All 3 of Stan Weighty's sons preceded him in death. But he still had 2 daughters, and he wrote one of them, daughter Jacqueline, in 1871, just a few weeks before his own death, which, by the way, occurred at his old homestead on Grand River. You just see, just poignantly, he wanted to go back toward the happiest days of his life with his family and children, and his beloved wife, Sally, as he called her, before the war took place. He died alone. They found his body there on his old place near the Grand River, which had been burned down and destroyed by federal troops during the war. To his daughter, you can't imagine how, as a father, this will hit close to home, right? How lonely I am up here at our old place without any of my dear children being with me. I would be so happy to have you here, but you must go to school. So he was putting his own desires to have his children with him behind sending them to school. So, the epitaph. What is the epitaph of Stan Weighty? I'll share with you the views of just a couple of folks here in closing. Mabel Anderson, who wrote the book The Life of General Stan Weighty in early 1900s, and interviewed numerous of his actual troopers, Cherokee mounted rifles that were still alive. She said Sherman's terrible raid on a smaller scale might have been repeated in Indian Territory in Texas had it not been for General Weighty and his command. His brigade was like a stone wall between Texas and the foe. And that's why in our book, The Oklahomans, I summarize it. I've never actually read this in anyone else's book, so I may be off the reservation again, Steve, but you edited it, and Dr. Castor, you saw it, so it got past you guys, so I'll share the blame with you if it's wrong. But we dare to say that Stan Weighty and the Confederates won a strategic victory in the war between the states and Indian Territory because the Union's main aim, they wanted to get food, they wanted cattle to feed the troops and all, but so the Confederates, their main aim was to use as a backdoor launching stage to invade Texas from the north. And Stan Weighty and the Cherokee Mounted Rifles and Tandy Walker and the Choctaws and Chickasaws, John Jumper and the Seminoles, they made him pay too dearly. They came down one time. General William Phillips, Scottish general, very fine, he was a colonel at the time in the Union Army, just blazed a bloody trail, slashing the throats of all their prisoners down to Middle Boggy. That's as far as they ever came. Because anytime they would do that, Stan Weighty and the Cherokee Mounted Rifles would come around behind them, cut off their supply lines, steal their horses. And they finally decided it's not worth it. They stayed in Fort Gibson. Basically, north of the Arkansas River was Union territory, south was Confederate territory. Stan Weighty and his men prevented the Federals from invading Texas. No less than Edward Everett Dale. Any of y'all that attended OU spent more hours, and I see some heads nodding, than you would like in Dale Hall. Many of the humanities courses for entering freshmen are there. Who knew who Dale was when we went there? I sure didn't. Greatest historian, in my opinion, in Oklahoma history, Edward Everett Dale, Dean of Oklahoma Historians. That's him. He also, Lee Todd, who's here, retired educator from Tipton. There you are. He was actually at our talk at Frederick, Tillman County Historical Society the other night. Came back for more abuse today, but he or one of his compadres told us that Edward Everett Dale grew up just across the North Fork of the Red River, which it was determined was not the real Red River. That's why Oklahoma got several of those counties. Old Greer County that used to be Texas. Edward Everett Dale cowboyed as a young man in Old Greer County when it was Texas, but then became a Harvard-educated head of the OU History Department, greatest Oklahoma historian, with the possible exception of Dr. Castor here, of course. And he co-wrote and collected the letters of the Cherokees in the 1800s in that book, Cherokee Cavaliers. And at the beginning of that book, there's over 200 letters, dozens of Cherokees' letters in there, great and small, men and women, various political views. He dedicates the book to one person, to the memory of General Stan Weighty, patriot, soldier, and statesman. This volume is reverently dedicated. Now, I just have to confess, if Dr. Dale would say that, then I'm a fan. I don't need to know anymore. And then another tribute. I'm going to skip over this because I know we're running short on time, but I'll just say the end of it. Mrs. A.K. Hardcastle wrote to Sarah Weighty, his widow. And by the way, I say this to you young people, and even some of you not so young people, we get discouraged, don't we? Sometimes as we're older, we look back and we think, oh, what if I'd only this, or I hadn't have done that. If we're still breathing, our hearts are still beating, God has not written the final chapters in our lives here on planet Earth yet, right? There is yet time to accomplish. And I think we need to remind ourselves that, because sometimes we think we've made no difference. And I've come to the conclusion our greatest works usually take place after we've passed and we're remembered. Sometimes people look on us and what we said with a lot better viewpoint than when we're here among them. Have you noticed that? Ms. Hardcastle wrote to Mrs. Weighty, "His labors on earth have not been in vain. He has done much lasting good for his country and countrymen that will never be forgotten, but handed down to the future generations in the book of history for them to follow in his footsteps and aspire to leave their footprints on the sands of time as well as he. Mesa and Josh and other young people here, again, don't let the call of the crowd be your determining factor. Be faithful to God, follow in his way, and leave your reputation and your work and your epitaph to him. The United States government thought enough of him to devote a postage stamp to Stan Weighty in 1995. But alas, it's not unanimous, right? As we look at a picture of, is it former yet, Glenn Cosper, Stan Weighty the former Stan Weighty Elementary School in Oklahoma City. And you'll notice there on their former marquee, Home of the Foxes, and that's a red fox. Kind of like Red Fox, yeah. So Stan Weighty was apparently on the wrong side, so they just took his name off that building, just like they took General Lee's statue down all over the country. And, people say, well, it's good for, mending fences and all. Okay, well, just say the same thing when they come for your Lincoln statue, your Columbus statue, your Washington statue, because I promise you, folks, they are coming for all of them. Okay, they're coming for all of them. It's not going to stop with Robert E. Lee or Stan Weighty. So this great man, the school is no longer named for him. I don't know who it's named for. But in closing, finally, that's his burial place at Polson Cemetery up in northeast Oklahoma. Takes a lot of driving, right? Grace went with me. You got to go through some gravel roads and some dirt roads. In fact, take a picnic and make a day of it. Stan Weighty's buried there. The Boudinauts are buried there. It's an awesome place, and that's his lasting memorial. And I close with these words from Wilfred Knight, his biographer, the great book, Red Fox. No monuments nor marble shafts keep silent record of the time when gray-clad ranks of warriors rode the Indian line. But mists of time have not eclipsed the ancient stories of his day, and still the whispered words are heard, Stan Weighty passed this way. The noon of darkness casts its spell, Dutch Billy's bugle sounds once more, and Weighty heads his column out to ride through legend's door. Now once again the muskets fire while eagle buzzards spirit soars and smoothbores spew their deadly hail as Weighty leads to war. But now the red fox rides no more. No bands of men with muffled sound slip through the night to strike at dawn. The fight is through, the moon is down. Now who will sing old Weighty's song? And who will tell his tale? And who will keep the rendezvous along the Texas Trail? Thank you very much.